artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, welcome to episode 214. I'm talking with Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who is co-chair of the British All-Party Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence, which he founded in 2016 with Member of Parliament Stephen Metcalfe. Tim has a new book out called Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, AI Governance and Policy for the Future. And while it came out in the UK in March, its North American release date is July 18th. Tim was also the initiator of and subsequent member of the Special Inquiry Select Committee into AI in Weapons Systems, whose final report, Proceed with Caution, Artificial Intelligence in Weapons Systems, was published on December 1st, 2023. He is also former Liberal Democrat House of Lords spokesperson for Science, Innovation and Technology, and former chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, which reported in 2018 with AI in the UK, Ready, Willing and Able, and its follow-up report in 2020, AI in the UK, No Room for Complacency. That and much, much more. Last week we talked about regulation, obviously, although not exclusively, with Tim giving a big picture of how that regulation has been proceeding on the global stage since before large language models were a thing, giving us the context that took us from the Asilomar Principles to today's Hiroshima Principles, and the EU AI Act, and the new ISO standard 42001 for AI. And we talked about long-term planning, intellectual property rights, and the effects of the open letters that called for a pause or moratorium on model training, and much, much more. So let's get back into the interview with Lord Tim Clement-Jones. We are recording this days before the UK general election. It will air afterwards, so anything we say that hinges upon the outcome of that election is going to sound silly. But if we don't talk about that, but instead I am interested to know how and where you see AI being relevant to that general election, either as an issue or as a technology that affects the mechanism of the election in any way.
It certainly had interest. I mean, I do kind of national hustings in the kind of science and technology area and in the creative industries area. So I've done a few of those. That's when they wheel on people like me for that sort of thing, when we're too decrepit to go round the streets, so to speak. But it's been really interesting how much focus in both the creative industries and in the science and technology area, how much focus there has been on AI and AI regulation and the opportunities for AI and the difficulties in terms of intellectual property for the creative industries, both for artists. And let's not forget the writers and actors strike in Hollywood, the underlying cause of that. One of the big underlying causes was AI and their fear that their performances were going to be synthesized and the writers were worried about AI being used to substitute for them and so on. So over here, yes, there was a considerable interest, but as you can imagine, I'm afraid our key areas have been cost of living, National Health Service, and sewage, basically. And I think those have been the three areas that people have had, and housing, and that those have been the four key areas, quite rightly in a way, that have been at the focus. But of course, I'm a great believer in AI being a solver of problems. I do believe that, for instance, just in the way that computer-aided design was able to speed up the design process in architecture, we can use AI in the health service, for instance, to improve the service, better diagnosis and prescription, better understanding of the spread of cancer and how to treat it and so on. There's been quite a bit in everybody's manifestos about how constructively we can use AI in a number of different ways, principally in the health service, but also the Labour manifesto and our Liberal Democrat manifesto talked about regulation of AI for the future and so on and so forth. So it has been there, but I wouldn't say that it's been right front and center. but it has meant that within certain communities, there's been quite a lot of discussion, and it's been extremely interesting. It's been the first election ever that has actually had AI in the manifestos, to my knowledge.
And much has been made about the effect of AI-generated disinformation influencing election results. That's a traceable thing in votes that were held in 2016. Yet it doesn't seem to have played out to the levels that were predicted, and certainly could have. We know that technology exists. We know there hasn't been enough regulation by the social media companies to prevent it. It has not happened on the scale that it certainly could have, or would you disagree?
No, I think you're absolutely right. We have yet to see how it's going to play out in the US elections, and I suspect it's going to be much more prevalent there because that's a less regulated kind of culture. But in the UK, I thought we'd see much more deep fakery during our elections. And it's almost as if people having been sensitized to it, and after all, we do have an independent election commission as well. Parties do have to put a digital stamp on all forms of digital communication. That's not true of others, but the parties have to do that. And it may be that we're developing a better form of digital literacy during elections. Now, that all sounds, again, a bit optimistic, perhaps, but I do think that it's good that we haven't had that. But, we had a program the other day. It was experimental. One of our broadcasters had a whole load of people in different rooms, played them different forms of deep fake messages from the party leaders, and they voted accordingly. They were led to vote in particular ways by the deep fakes that they saw. So we're not immune to that. It's just that at the moment, our parties they may be delivering misinformation in terms of statistics, but then that's common. That's not new. You're accusing somebody of going to put up tax by this, that, and the other, or doom and gloom is going to occur. That's all standard political discourse. But we haven't seen the use of deep fakery to anything like the degree that we thought it would.
Well, and talking about that, how does international cooperation play out when the talks about how to regulate AI start to converge on the international stage when there are nations like Russia, which has been linked to election interference through manipulation of social media with AI, and China, which is being linked to cybersecurity attacks through AI. Granted, those are both hard to prove conclusively, but that is actually part of the problem. There's no doubt in certain parties' minds that those things have happened. Proving them to the satisfactory of an international tribunal is another matter. And then are we heading towards another sort of classic schism on the international stage where there will be treaties signed by everyone except them?
Yes, I think that's not true of AI, strangely enough, but I do entirely agree with it. I think the cyber world, and in terms of information, a particular kind of confidential information, know-how that is acquired through cyber breaches and so on, or ransomware attacks and so on. I mean, I think you have to treat certain entities as bad actors. Now, the China situation is kind of where the jury's still out in a sense, but the jury's not out on Russia. There have been so many cyber attacks from Russian actors. And of course, the world of quantum is thundering down the track as well. And if a quantum gets in the wrong hands, then frankly, our cybersecurity is going to have to be ramped up. If we think that multi-factor authentication is a pain in the neck, well, we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of securing ourselves against attack from outside. So I think AI is a slightly different issue, but I do think that it'll be ramped up in terms of our cybersecurity as we get more sophisticated computing power. And I think quantum will be that frontier.
It is just staggering to me how many different issues, fundamental issues, this covers. And one that I didn't see getting a lot of attention in your book that I want to raise here because it is, I think, on point, is AI's role in the concentration of capital. And this affects issues like welfare or universal basic income. And there's an effect in AI that it's deployed by large companies, and the benefit accrues to the founders of those companies, the investors in those companies, to a lesser extent, the key employees in those companies, but not at all to the people whose jobs are displaced by the automation created by those companies. And so this seems to result in capital piling up in places where there was already quite enough of it and being drained in other places where it's needed. That's how it seems to me. How do you see this issue playing out, and what should be done about it?
There are two areas, really, which I think you need to think about in this context. I mean, the first is basically competition, digital competition between the big tech players. That concerns me as well, and I do talk about that. In a sense, the way that if you have access to supercompute power, exacompute, if you like, you've got access to sophisticated semiconductors, massive data sets, and extremely high-level AI digital skills, then those are rare commodities costing a huge amount of money. And we know that large language models now, cost of developing them is growing year on year on year. Now, that may change. We may get different forms of machine learning and so on, which I would welcome. But at the moment, that's all tending towards huge monopoly power. And I suspect we'll see consolidation amongst some of the big players too. And we'll see acquisition by the Apples of this world. We're already seeing Microsoft really beginning to flex its muscles and so on. So we'll see all that. But the second point about job loss, it's the reason I touch on some of the work that's been done about what the level of automation is going to be in the future, how we can adjust to it and so on. But my view is, and it's a bit like if you look at all the photographs of Fifth Avenue in, I think it was 1903 versus 1913. In the 1903 picture, there is one automobile and all the rest is horses and carriages. And then you look in 1913 and there isn't a single horse and carriage. It's all automobiles. So change can take place extremely fast, but whether or not we can adapt to it is the big thing. So I just tend to believe that actually we will be creating new jobs. This isn't by automating certain tasks, doesn't mean to say that we're delivering or we're getting rid of a whole bunch of actual jobs. I think we're making certain jobs better through using AI systems. And there are bound to be certain things that disappear. But for instance, in an Amazon warehouse, what has disappeared is the picking and so on, because that's now done by robots. But actually the supervision, the checking, but a lot of the packing, that is done by humans and will probably continue to be that in terms of the relative future, but we'll see. But I think that given a period of time, we will manage to adjust to it. So I am an optimist to that extent, but we have to think about, universal basic benefit or whatever we might call it for the future. If we find that our society is indeed creating these kinds of imbalances, but that's why government is there. We have to assess what impact on society AI is having and do something about it. We don't just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, it's all inevitable. We have to think very carefully, like we created the welfare state at the beginning of the 20th century, Lloyd George in 1906 and pensions and so on. That was in response to people living longer and needing a basic income. Well, it may be people will need a basic income from their 20s onwards, but we have to adjust to it. And it means that we're going to have to be a hell of a lot more productive than we are now to be able to afford that kind of benefit.
I think we're talking about one of the big fears at the moment, one of the big wounds in society, because every audience I talk to, the number one fear under the surface is losing their job. Even among groups where I would think, why are you concerned about that? You are safe, as far as I can tell, for the rest of your life. That is what is going on. And where this comes to a head is in education, not because teachers are in danger of losing jobs, but because they have to prepare students to enter a completely unpredictable job market. What does school boards and government do with respect to pivoting education to what looks like a fundamental change?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. For a start, in the workplace, I think if you're going to have people acting ethically as employers, you need to enforce some kind of algorithmic impact assessment before major AI projects are put into place. And I'm a great believer in proper corporate governance. And I think that it could lead, we talk about ESG nowadays for corporates, that's the mantra. Well, we should be putting in the G a lot of AI governance. So it's very important that corporates and even small business are aware of the impact of what they're doing when they introduce new AI systems. But as far as educators are concerned, and I'm a huge fan of what teachers manage to do and adjust to in this day and age. I was at a school on Saturday where I just couldn't believe some of the quality of what was being done. You have to understand that this is not just all about scientific STEM skills. It's about creative skills as well. It's about critical thinking. It's about those kinds of softer skills. The use of an AI tool in a creative way may well be one of the skills of being able to communicate. These things are human skills. So I think it's not just going to put a premium on people developing AI systems and so on, whereas after all, we know that LLMs can write code nowadays. It's going to be about how we use our creative skills in the workplace using these new AI tools, which I think that could be a fantastic skill. So all this talk about arts degrees not being valuable and so on, I think people have to get over all that. I mean, I'm a big fan of pure maths campaigns because I want to see people still thinking, getting great breakthroughs in maths and theorems and so on and so forth. But I also want to see people really harnessing those creative skills for the future.
Oh, exactly. I couldn't agree more. People still learn and enjoy chess, even though they know there's no chance of them winning against a computer, because it's enjoyable and because it stretches their brain in ways that are useful for other things. But you mentioned ESG. I want to talk about the E part, the ethics part. AI, it seems to me, amplifies the culture of any place that it's applied. And to take as an example that we're both familiar with, the Post Office Horizon scandal, that to me seemed to be that it was caused by a culture of callous indifference, and that AI was the excuse for visiting cruelty upon numerous unfortunate sub-postmasters. Anyone who is listening doesn't know what I'm talking about, thinks that might be hyperbole, go look it up. But then there are positive effects for businesses that have positive cultures, like using AI to personalize corporate communications so that they land in a way that people of different cultures, languages, backgrounds, learning levels can understand because they've been individually tailored, something we can do right now with large language models. Those are really good. So is it possible to have our cake and eat it too, to deploy AI so that those places with the positive cultures can use it for those benefits without places that are going to use it to abuse their staff and customers?
Yes, I think it is, but you have to be pretty conscious about this. I mean, the computer says no type culture. That's really worrying. The fact that not that long ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was, we actually changed our rules of evidence so that computer evidence didn't have to be proven. It could be taken at face value. And so the presumption was that it was accurate unless you could show a jolly good reason why it wasn't. And of course, none of the post office, sub-postmasters managed to do that. Well, very few. And certainly they weren't given any inkling by the post office that that was the case. But what worries me more than anything else is, and it's symptomatic really, and it's demonstrated by the Horizon case, is over-reliance. So this for me is part of what our educators should be doing. It's part of our digital literacy and so on. If we simply continually over-rely on AI, what it does for us, what our expectations are, and so on and so forth, it's going to substitute for us and our skills are going to drop away. Now, it may sound a bit optimistic, but that's my worry. But on the other hand, I do believe it is possible to avoid being over-reliant. You have to keep skills alive of things like summary and précis and creative activity and so on, and not just simply say the machine can do all this for me. You want to keep comparing yourself against what a machine does versus what you do. I think it's quite horrifying, actually, that so many professional firms are simply leaving recruitment now to AI systems. Young people entering jobs now, especially in the professions, are finding almost universally that the systems used to recruit them are not people. In the first instance, they're all machines. And I don't think that's a good look. And I think people are falling down by doing that. And I don't think they'll get the recruits who've got the real human qualities that are needed, quite honestly, at the end of the day. So, yeah, I'm quite equivocal, but I think if we are conscious that over-reliance is a real risk, then we can push back. And, my friend Martin Rees, Lord Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal, who was the Master of Trinity, Cambridge, I mean, he really illustrated for me why this is the hidden risk. The over-reliance issue is a very big deal as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, so many things that we could talk about here, but our time is limited. I wanted to talk about the Autonomous Vehicles Act. That will have to wait for another time. I want people to pay attention to your optimism in this and how it is balanced with the realism that you're applying here, because too many people want to fall on one extreme or the other, and I think you're doing a extremely good job of demonstrating how to balance all of those. I want to wrap up here with a question about trust of AI, and that would fall in the category of privacy and personal information. And the way I want to illustrate this is you've got an extraordinarily efficient personal assistant that I dealt with to arrange our meeting and everything, and I'll wager that she is effective because of a lot of things she knows about you, your personal tastes, and other things that are not for general consumption. If we want AI to fulfill that function, I'm not talking about putting her out of a job, I'm talking about making that more available to a wider class of people in general, we have to be able to place the same trust in AI. It is simply obvious that it cannot serve your interests if it doesn't know what those are. And the more you tell it, the better it can do. But at the moment, that provokes a huge discussion about privacy because of not knowing what businesses are going to do with all that data, which they use to market us, for instance, to advertisers. How can we tackle this? I love giving you the easy questions. How can we tackle this if we want to get that AI personal assistant that we can trust?
It's about making sure we have proper standards which are incorporated and regulated for. For instance, I would trust an AI assistant. I might not necessarily use it, but I would trust an AI assistant if there was a form of kite marking, for instance. So I knew that there'd been a rigorous assessment as to whether it conforms to our data protection regulations, whether there'd been a proper risk assessment, that it had been assessed for bias in its decision-making. It had been assessed, in a sense, stress tested for what it would do in certain circumstances. There was a continuous monitoring standard as well applied. So I would then think, yes, it's got that kite mark, and that begs the question where the kite mark comes from, of course, but it could be self-assessed as long as there was independent audit or something of that sort of whether or not certain standards have been met. We haven't got into the foothills of that yet, but if that was the case, I would trust it. And, already I'm seeing AI systems where it's plain to me that the accuracy of what they're doing is very high. It's just that what I don't have is that kind of kite marking. And so I don't have full confidence and I have to check pretty much everything. But where you have the sources of information given, then what's not to like? And increasingly, I think nowadays the developers realize that actually human sources or AI information are maybe the name of the game, because that's what we really trust at the end of the day, provided that those human sources are like the BBC or the New York Times or whatever it may be. They're trusted sources of information. So that's a very complicated way of saying, I think you've still got to have a human in the loop, or at least human products in the loop.
And it's a good way of wrapping up to show the role and value of standardization and regulation in this. And for our listeners outside the UK, the kite mark is a sign on a product that indicates that it meets a British Standards Institute level of approval.
Yeah, and the European Union has a similar sort of mark as well of conformity in products and so on, environmental performance and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a well-accepted way of demonstrating conformity.
Well, thank you so much. Not that we could ever hope to cover something this broad in an hour, but I think we have done sterling service to it in that hour. Your book, Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, just released in North America, been out for some time, of course, in the United Kingdom. And we will have a link to that in the show notes and transcript. And what would you like to leave our listeners with in terms of final thoughts and things about yourself or others that you would like them to go to for further reading or perusal?
Well, I think be optimistic about what humans are capable of. What I don't think we need to do is just simply crumble in the face of technology. We can direct how technology should be used. It isn't just a question of saying, oh, well, there's this new technology, it's inevitable. We can help direct how it's used and the purpose for which it's used. So that's what I would say. And let's grapple with this. And we all need to do that, whether it's your kids using smartphones or whether it's at work and the AI tools that become available, or just understanding what is happening out there. We all can make our contribution.
Well, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, thank you for doing all of that heavy lifting, listening to countless evidence givers and synthesizing into reports, and above all for projecting that optimism to audiences like this one. And especially thank you for coming on AI and You.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a huge pleasure.
And that's the end of the interview. One of the obvious meta takeaways there is how seriously governments, or at least some governments, or at least some members of some governments, are taking AI, and how much they're willing to take on to deal with it and the associated risks thoughtfully. By the way, Tim mentioned Lord Martin Rees there, who is Britain's Astronomer Royal, but who also co-founded the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and wrote the book Our Final Hour, A Scientist's Warning, about existential threats such as AI. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, a study performed at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business investigated whether an LLM could successfully perform financial statement analysis in a way similar to a professional human analyst, and I'm just going to quote nearly verbatim from the abstract. They provided standardized and anonymous financial statements to GPT-4 and instructed the model to analyze them to determine the direction of future earnings. Even without any narrative or industry-specific information, the LLM outperformed financial analysts in its ability to predict earnings changes. The LLM exhibited a relative advantage over human analysts in situations when the analysts tend to struggle. Furthermore, they found that the prediction accuracy of the LLM was on par with the performance of a narrowly trained, state-of-the-art machine learning model. The LLM prediction did not stem from its training memory. Instead, they found that the LLM generated useful narrative insights about a company's future performance. Lastly, their trading strategies based on GPT-4's predictions yielded a higher Sharpe ratio and alphas than strategies based on other models. Taken together, their results suggest that LLMs may take a central role in decision-making. Is that whistling sound the wind of change blowing away 1,000 jobs at a Big Four accounting firm? Or am I over-dramatizing? For sure, a company whose entire business model is built around financial numbers is going to run the numbers to see whether LLMs improve the bottom line, and not retain humans out of sentimentality alone if the numbers favor the chatbots. That other noise I hear may be a few million people starting to ask GPT-4 for trading advice. Next week, my guest will be John Danaher, Senior Lecturer in Law at National University of Ireland, Galway, and author of Automation and Utopia, Human Flourishing in a World Without Work. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.